So some of you guys may have worked with some video editing software in the past, Avid, Premiere, that kind of thing. If you've worked with Adobe Premiere, or really anything Adobe, which you guys have, this has very similar principles and kind of setup to that. One of the things you have to remember with After Effects, though, that is different than other video editing programs. And it's kind of sort of similar to the metaphor that you get in Premiere. We have a project that we work in, and each one of that project itself is kind of like a big folder, and inside that project we can have different compositions. So the compositions themselves are like your actual working files. So you could start one project for this and have the 4 different principles, each has a composition inside here, is the idea. So each composition that you create, you need a name. It makes sense. This one is going to be, maybe principles of animation, or principle 1, whatever you want to call it. All right. Now, your presets on this are really the important part. Now, this stuff that you're choosing out of here are all of the different presets you've got for video formats and animation formats. There are many, many, many of these in there. What it comes down to is you need to check your destination, okay? If this is, animations can be any size. Like, we're not limited to these sizes, these screen sizes. We can do custom sizes, which is what I'll probably do here in a minute. But the defaults in here are going to depend on what your screen size is when you release this. Is it meant to be seen on phones? Is it meant to be seen on some sort of monitor? Like, you got to know ahead of time what your destination is before you set this thing up. And that's what all this stuff is. It's just all your different like formats that you could use. HD, PAL, if it's going to be seen in Europe, that kind of stuff. But generally, we can do custom sizes, okay? So the custom sizes are really what you're going to be looking for these animations. They can be basically any size, is the idea. 1920 by 1080 is kind of your HD default. So you can probably leave it there and be pretty safe with it, would be the idea. I need a little web banner that I'm going to animate just to show you the idea of how to do a little animation in a web banner. And the size of this one is 1200 by 500. So I'm just going to go ahead and make my destination 1200 by 500. Now, I just turned off the little lock pixel aspect ratio button there. If you leave that on, it will lock your aspect ratio to a video ratio. It'll be a 16 by 9 format essentially, or 3 by 4 depending on what size you're releasing it in. 16 by 9 for that. If you turn off the aspect ratio, though, you can do any custom size you want, is the idea. Now this, crazy important, frame rate, okay? This is what I was talking about before with animation. Remember, animation, when you guys looked at the principles of animation, animation is basically just a flip book style type of thing. You got one page after another that you turn and your animation happens, that kind of thing. Same thing here. The default for all video, for the most part, again, depending on where you're releasing this, but the minimum frame rate for video usually is, or the standard is 29.97 frames per second. You can change this. So one thing, if you do change this, and I change my frame rates all the time to tweak my animations, sometimes you want animations that look a little choppy. It's one of those things that you kind of, again, the look and feel is up to you as the designer. If you decrease this frame rate to about 15, you get kind of a weirder cartoony type of feel out of it. If you increase it to 60 frames per second, you get very smooth animations and things that will run very cleanly on damn near anything. But the problem is, you got to remember, if you're changing your frame rate, the default is 30 frames per second. We have to be aware how long stuff takes, right? So if you change this, you're going to be changing the time scale in your project, and that throws your timing all off. You got to remember exactly where you set this. Leave it at 29.97 for the most part, unless you really need to change it. Some of these other things in here we'll get into later, like where to start and where to end your time code. Background color, that's just the background color of your actual stage, your working area. So set that to whatever you want, and you click OK. All right, now, hopefully After Effects will open, so I can close Photoshop real quick here. So this is the working area, the working kind of setup. Let me move this over so you can see this, so I can see the chat. There we go. My working area for After Effects. And I'm not a buttonology guy. I don't like going through every button and showing everybody every button, because that's stupid. That's what you guys should be doing on your own time. I'm going to show you the kind of functional stuff you need right out of the gate, and we'll get to some of that other stuff later. Just very brief overview here, though. Tools are on top. Your tools and all the stuff that you need are on top up here. There are not very many tools in After Effects, as you see. There's only a little short bar of these things up top. We can do a lot of stuff with them, though. This secondary window, notice if you click things, this is a pretty important thing in Adobe Premiere and Adobe After Effects, like the video style stuff in Adobe. When you select a window, now notice there's separate windows in here. There's 3 different areas minimum that I can select that turn blue when I click them. That's pretty damn important. Those are your working areas. Now, selecting those areas before you do stuff in them is pretty important. Remember, in After Effects, there's all kinds of keyboard shortcuts and all kinds of crazy stuff we're going to get into. Some of those only apply to certain regions of this screen. If I've got this clicked over here and I'm trying to apply a keyboard shortcut to my timeline, it probably won't. It'll apply it to the stuff up here because there's different kind of keyboard shortcuts and stuff. So before you do anything, make sure you have the right area selected. This area over here on the left is your kind of your project library, right? All of your files get pulled in through here. So this is where you put in all your graphics, all your video, all your audio, anything you're going to need in here gets dumped into this section, and you reference it from here. Okay. So when I'm going to pull in my stuff here in a second, all my my graphics, I'll just double click in this gray area or do file import or Command-I, Control-I. There's about 6 ways to get stuff into After Effects. This area here in the middle is your working composition. It's your stage, right? So that's where everything takes place. That's where you can see what's happening. This is kind of unique though. If you've ever worked in a video program, you know that you can't zoom in and out on stuff like the actual stage itself. You can in After Effects. You can zoom way out and you can zoom way in just by rolling your mouse, essentially, okay? So that's something I usually zoom out a little bit so I can see the full stage. We'll actually pull stuff off the stage and work with it outside the area, kind of like Illustrator is the idea. It actually teams up with Illustrator really well. We'll get into that later too. Bottom button down here's your timeline, okay? That's the most important part. Obviously, this is where we do all of our animating, is in the timeline section. After Effects, kind of keep in mind, After Effects likes to nest stuff. This is one of the programs in Adobe where when you first start using it, your tools aren't really apparent and stuff gets hidden a lot. It's gonna warn you. On the timeline, stuff gets hidden out a lot and you gotta like dig to find it. So I'll go through this a little more slowly. So now that I've kind of talked, last things I guess, on the right over here, these are all of your different palettes, okay? Just like in Photoshop, right? You've got all your different palettes for the different options and stuff. That's all on the right, okay? So we'll get to that stuff later. Don't need it yet. All right, let's actually do something, okay? So first things first, before I do anything, I'm gonna click on this there's one thing resident in the bin. This on the top left is your composition. This icon, now icons in your bin are really important in After Effects. This icon is like a little circle, a blue circle, a red square, and a green triangle. That's the icon for a composition, okay? Each thing you import will have a different icon, which is really helpful for trying to parse this stuff out later. You'll eventually get hundreds of things in here, and it's really hard to keep them sorted without the icons. So keep that in mind. It even says type, composition, frame rate, all this different stuff is in there. You can select it by double clicking it, and you notice down here on your timeline, in the top left, there's a little tab that says Principles of Animation. That is my composition, okay? Remember, in any project, we could have multiple compositions is the idea. So I'm gonna make sure that I'm working inside this composition, okay? Let's import some stuff. Let's get some stuff moving around in here. So like I said, you can do file import, you can drag and drop, I just double click on this gray area right here. This is the easiest way to do it, is just any place where there's not a file or something, double click it, and it lets you find your stuff. Okay, so if you've done this right, you've got the stuff in a folder already, and you can just import it. Now, I'm going to hold down Command on my keyboard, right? Everybody hopefully knows this keyboard shortcut. Just like multiples of something, Control or Command in Adobe is the idea. So I'm going to import all my pictures, right? Now, this is a PSD. I actually don't need that. I could use that PSD, and I'm going to do that later for you guys, but I'm just going to work with the actual graphics themselves. So what I'm going to do is try and animate this little web banner that I had before. I'm going to go ahead and throw in, drag and drop, from my bin to my stage, okay, to my composition area. Just drag and drop. Does a couple of things. Automatically, it goes and adds that to my timeline as a layer, okay? So I'm going to add another one in here real quick just to show you what this does right out of the gate. I'm going to grab this little 4 hands load, or maybe I'll do the hand sanitizer bottle next, throw that in there. If you look at this stuff, what it just did here as well, okay, down on my timeline down here, it added a layer automatically as soon as I dropped it to the stage. The best way for you guys to think about After Effects is to think of it as motion Photoshop. Like After Effects, the metaphors are really, really similar. It's got layers you can work with. It automatically names the layers when you drop stuff in there. You can transform stuff the way you would in Photoshop. Notice the bounding boxes are around this thing, this object, and I can scale it to fit on my screen and stuff like that. So just like Photoshop, you can do all that stuff on the fly, right? I can grab this object out here and I can just scale it down. Now, this is an annoying thing. You guys know that in the new version of Photoshop, right, to scale something proportionally, it just does it automatically when you grab and scale something in the new version of Photoshop. The old version, it doesn't do that in After Effects. The old version of Adobe, which you guys may or may not have worked with, you have to hold down Shift to keep things proportional. That's really important in After Effects. To scale something proportionally, hold down Shift, because otherwise you squash your stuff and it looks goofy. But you want to squash it sometimes for squash and stretch, which we'll do later here in a minute, but start it off with the right size, okay? So hold down Shift to move stuff around. You can rename stuff, and just like with Photoshop down here, each one of these is a layer, okay? If you hit Enter on it, you can rename it. I don't know why I'd want to rename the same thing, but you could, you know, that's the idea. So you can rename stuff. You can drag and drop to move it around. If I want this behind my other layer, just like in Photoshop, you drag and drop, okay? Pretty straightforward, I feel like. Now, then you look at all the jillion of buttons that are on this thing, okay? There are a ton of buttons in here and a ton of switches in here that do all kinds of different stuff we're going to get into later. Ignore all that stuff for now. The only one you really need is the eyeball. The eyeball is really helpful for turning on and off your layers, just like in Photoshop. We're going to use that a lot, like a whole lot. The cool thing is that you can just drag to turn these on and off. You don't have to click them individually. You can just drag and turn them all on and off at once. It's pretty slick. All right, so that's your real basics in this palette. Okay, other things we got to worry about. So in After Effects, when you drop something onto your timeline, okay, my timeline has a predetermined length, right? So in my composition settings, this is something I didn't really touch on yet because we didn't have any settings yet. This composition has defaulted to a specific length, okay? Down here on the bottom, I'm not actually seeing my full timeline, which is kind of annoying. Down here on the bottom in After Effects, you have a little mountain icon that you can either click the mountain icon or you can drag this little bar. This allows you to zoom in and out on your timeline's length, right? If I zoom all the way out, I can see that my composition is 30 seconds long, okay? So the timing for your composition is up here along the top of your bar, okay? This is in seconds. You can change that to pick to frames if you want later. That's not very helpful, but it's in seconds, which is great, 30 frames per second, okay? This, just like with any other video program, is your scrubber. This is your timeline bar here, your scrubber. You can use this to preview your animation, scrub through it, all that other kind of stuff. So it goes from 0 seconds to 30 seconds, linear, from left to right, okay, is the idea. Now, any object that is a graphic that you drop into After Effects defaults to be the entire length of your composition, okay? Each graphic that I've got on screen right now is on there for 30 seconds. That's not what I want, right? I don't want this hand sanitizer bottle in there the whole time. I'm gonna have it bounce in to just illustrate squash and stretch would be the idea. So this thing, I can grab the ends. Okay, so each bar, this little purpley looking bar in here is actually literally how long this thing is on screen, okay? So I can grab the beginning of this if I want and drag it. Say it's gonna come in at like 4 seconds. 4 seconds is way too long. Let's say 2 seconds, okay? You just grab the beginning of it. And now the hand sanitizer bottle doesn't show up for 2 seconds, okay? Same thing on the other end. If I want the thing to only be on screen for a couple of seconds, okay, I can drag the end of it to that as well. Now, there are keyboard shortcuts for this, which are pretty slick, okay? If you hit Option on your keyboard, okay, Option or Alt if you're on PC, so Option or Alt, and the right bracket, okay? The right bracket, Option right bracket or Alt right bracket, will set your endpoint. Okay, well, if I scrub over to 22 seconds, Alt, right bracket, blammo, drops my endpoint. And think conversely, Alt, left bracket, sets the endpoint. Okay, so Alt left bracket is endpoint, Alt right bracket is outpoint. That is crazy helpful. You can drag stuff around if you want on the timeline by hand, but it's not as accurate, it's not as precise. What I can do here, the cool thing about this, is I can scrub, check this out, I use my time code over here on the left. Notice when I just drug this thing over to 6 seconds, say I wanted it to come in at 6 seconds. I dropped it here on 6 seconds, but if I look at my time code, okay, my time code, if you're not familiar with time code goes in hours, minutes, seconds, and frames, okay? This is at 6 seconds and 2 frames, which is not at 6 seconds total. I can go in here and I can actually just type in exactly where I want that thing to go, and boom, I've got 6 seconds where my starting point is for that thing. Now, I'm at 6 seconds, Alt, left bracket, boom. That thing starts exactly at 6 seconds, right? That's why you want to use that keyboard shortcut, is animation needs to be precise, and that's the best way to do it. Roll over to a specific time code, punch in your time code, Alt right bracket, Alt left bracket, you're good to go. Okay, pretty slick. So now again, I don't want this to come in, I'm gonna have it come in at 2 seconds. So I'm just gonna change it with time code because it's faster. So just how much quicker this is. 2 seconds. Boom, Alt left bracket, blammo. Oops, I hit the wrong key. That was Command left bracket. That's another keyboard shortcut. If you hit Command or Control if you're on PC, this will switch your layers, which is kind of a crazy thing. You can move your layer order using Command right, Command left. That's the same thing as in Photoshop. Exactly the same keyboard shortcut. Option left sets that at its endpoint. Okay, so I got my endpoint set, right? Let's actually animate this darn thing. So it's on the timeline. I got it set up correctly. It's going to be 2 seconds before this thing comes in, and I'm going to have it bounce into screen. Okay, so what I'm going to do here for this object is I'm going to go back to a little bit past my 2 second mark, so I can see what I'm working with here. And I'm going to place my object off screen. Okay, be careful doing that in After Effects. This is where I want my animation to start, but the problem with that is that if you drag something off the stage, off the composition window, and you deselect it, it's there, but it has a little bounding box around it. You can't tell what it is though. You don't actually get to see that graphic. So you gotta remember what you put over here, because lots of times you'll have lots of stuff floating off those edges. Be careful with that. Just remember what you put where off the edges and you should be okay. It's not super ordered whenever you get off the edge of the canvas. But it is off screen, okay? So now that I've got this graphic off screen, that's where I want it to start. So I'm gonna do a straight ahead animation. Remember in the principles of animation, we have straight ahead and pose to pose. Straight ahead animation is 1 keyframe at a time. I'm gonna go 1 frame at a time, and I'm gonna put this thing where it needs to go 1 frame at a time. And then next, after that, I'll show you how to do a pose to pose animation, where you put it in another place and let the keyframes fill in between that. So let's do straight ahead animation. So After Effects is a little wonky how you animate. The stuff's all hidden. How do you get to that? Make sure you have your layers selected down here, okay? Right over here next to the layer, I'm just gonna make this thing a little bigger, my cursor a little larger. Right over here, there's a triangle. There's a teeny tiny triangle next to your layer. Click that triangle. These are your transforms, okay? Think back to Photoshop. This is motion Photoshop, right? When you hit Control T in Photoshop, you do a transform, free transform. Transforms are all of your basic stuff. Their scale, right? Their position, opacity, all that stuff. If you drop down the triangle next to transform, flip, there's all the stuff we can animate, okay? So I've got anchor point, which is anchor point. If nobody's talked about that in classes with you before, it's fairly important. The anchor point of an object, let me zoom out a little bit on my stage here so you can see what I'm talking about. Actually, let me just move this guy in for a second here. So the anchor point of an object is set to the middle by default on stuff. You can move the anchor point of an object. Now, to change these things down here, I'm not animating anything yet. I'm just changing basic stuff here. I can move the anchor point on my object to a specific location. Okay. Why would you want to do that? What's the point of that? Because the object rotates based on that point, right? So not always do you want your object to rotate based on the center point of the object itself. Sometimes you want it to rotate based on the edge. So that's how you do it. You move your anchor point, okay? Now, I'm going to reset that stuff. If you hit reset, it takes everything back to the original size graphic, okay? Even the thing I did earlier when I scaled it down by hand. Scaling something by hand, if you notice, watch what happens in my palette down here. If I scale, it's going to mirror that in my palette, okay? So all that stuff is directly translatable. After Effects is very, very data-driven, okay? So all this stuff you can tune very specifically with numbers. If you want specific pixels in the positioning, if you want specific sizes, all that stuff is up for grabs that way. Or you can, look what I'm doing here, you can punch in specific numbers, or you can click, hold down on your mouse, and drag, okay? And it will spin those numbers. It's called a spinner, right? It's not a lot of stuff in Adobe has spinners, but if you click and drag on the number, it will spin and you can move this thing a lot faster. I'm just going to grab my spinner for position and move this thing right off screen. Okay, so it starts off screen. It's at negative 197 pixels outside of the screen area. Okay, 0, 0 is right here. Right, top left-hand corner is 0, 0. This is what this is basing this thing on. Is the position is on at negative 197, 275 down. Okay, the anchor point is what it's talking about. So let's actually animate. Now that we know anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity, those are all the basic transforms. Let's do a little simple animation. Now, all of this, and Premiere, Adobe Premiere, if you have worked with that, is very similar to this. This little stopwatch, this is a stopwatch icon. Okay, it's kind of hard to tell, but it's a stopwatch icon. You click that stopwatch icon, it drops this little diamond-shaped doodad into your timeline. That is a keyframe. Okay, keyframes. I'm gonna talk about these briefly. Some people may know what I'm talking about and they'll be bored, but we really need to talk about keyframes because they're crazy important. Keyframes are your animation. Okay, what keyframes do? Keyframes, they're exactly what they sound like. They're a key frame in your animation. Remember, animation runs in frames, right? If you punch this button in, like I've done now, it drops a keyframe on your timeline where your playback head was located, okay? So I dropped it here because my playback head was right here, is the idea. So click it, drops your keyframe. That cements that animation to that point. This is now point A, where I start my animation at. Now all you gotta do, now I've started it in the right spot, so it's over there. I'm going to move my timeline down a little further. Now, again, how long do you want this to take? I don't know. Let's go 1 full second here. So I started off at 2 seconds. I'm gonna go to 3 seconds, and let's see how this animation feels if I take a full second to move this object. Check this out. This is the cool thing about After Effects. If you just grab your object and drag it, say I'm gonna have it bounce in. Okay, so maybe it'll start up here and then bounce in when it hits the ground, right? Boom, it dropped the keyframe automatically, right? That's pretty slick, okay? So it's automatically recording what I'm doing. Now, if I want to move it further, I can just go down the timeline a little further. Bloop. Move this down here, okay? And it's gonna bounce in, so I'm gonna go a little further, move this up, a little further, move it down. Bam, there we go, okay? It has recorded everything that I've done. Each step of the way is a keyframe, right? So this thing's gonna kind of bounce in and end up here. Now, I haven't done any squash and stretch yet or anything like that, but that's a straight ahead animation, right? Is literally I'm just moving my timeline and then moving the object, moving my timeline and then moving the object, moving my timeline and moving the object. This, by far, is the most common form of animation. You're gonna be doing this a jillion times when you try to animate something over and over and over and over and over again, okay? Now, the really cool thing about After Effects, I find, if you look up here in your composition window, each one of those keyframes is marked. Like those keyframes are up there on your screen to manipulate. The cool thing is you can go in and you can drag these things. I can grab this keyframe. If you select it, say I don't like how high, I'm gonna rewind here. I don't like how high that thing went with this keyframe, okay? I can drag this keyframe wherever I want, right? I'm gonna flatten out my curve a little bit. Check this out though. This has Bezier handles on it, right? Think back to the pen tool in Illustrator if you've worked with that. Bezier handles let you change the curve, right? So you can really tweak this animation. Check it out. I can change this curve to whatever the heck I want. If I want some kind of quirky movement in this animation right here, I can drag this. If you hold down, this is pretty crazy, keyboard shortcut that you can't access unless you know it. If you hold down Option on Mac or Alt on PC, you can manipulate, just like an Illustrator, just one part of that curve, okay? So I can make a really sharp bounce right after this point. Look how much different this animation looks if I play it through. It's got that sharp curve in it, and then it kind of bounces down here. Now, these are all this is a pretty slow animation, all things considered, right? Like I'm gonna rewind it, and I'm gonna hit spacebar, okay? Spacebar plays your animation by default, okay? So you can rewind just by grabbing your playback head, scrub it back, hit spacebar, and that'll preview your animation for you, is the idea. Now, like I said, animation's running a little slow. I wanna speed this up a little bit. So, real easy in After Effects, okay? I'm gonna zoom in on my timeline, okay? Right down here, little zoom button, right? I'm gonna zoom in so I can see my keyframes a little better. This little doodad up top lets you move your timeline around like a little hand scrubber. You can just move your timeline back and forth after you zoom in on it. You can also zoom in and out using this. This is kind of a quick bar up top. It's pretty slick. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, move it over a little bit, and now you can literally just click your keyframes and drag them. Now, you can also click multiple keyframes and drag them, which is really slick, because I want to make this animation faster, right? Typical of animation, if you want your animation to run faster, you compress your keyframes, right? The more keyframes you have jammed into a small space, the faster something's going to run. It just makes sense. So I'm going to take these keyframes and proportionally drag them over, okay? And just eyeball it, right? You can get precise if you want to get precise. I accidentally moved my timeline there. Get precise if you want to get precise, but I'm just eyeballing it. You get a feel for this eventually. There we go. Rewind, spacebar, test my animation. Ah, that's a little more lively, right? So again, this is where I'm saying the look and feel for the animation is totally up to you. If I wanted it to come in slower and that was my objective, totally fine. Want it to come in faster, that's how you do it. Okay, pretty slick. Now, before I do anything else with this, I want to show you something that's kind of dangerous in After Effects. Be very careful when you go, because I'm gonna do some squash and stretch on this thing in a second. Be very careful when you're back over here clicking stuff in your timeline. If I click the same keyframe I just clicked, okay, this little stopwatch for my position, I've just laid out position keyframes. If I click this, it erases everything. And there's no way to get it back unless you Control Z, okay? It doesn't warn you either, right? You could, now this is something I've done before, I'm gonna warn you real hard here. You could do hours and hours of animation and accidentally click that button and then do 50 other steps, which is easy with animation, and then play through it and realize you've erased hours of work, right? Be real careful with that. There's no warnings or anything. It just happens. It's going to happen to you at some point. Save your file often and save your file in different versions really often. If you've done something that's really good and you've animated it and it looks really great, save your file and you file save as and name it V2 or V3 or V4, same different versions of this stuff. Trust me, you're going to want to do iterative saves on this, because if you do something stupid and mess up, you're going to want to be able to go back like 6 steps and catch some of this stuff. It happens all the time with animation. So progressive saving is pretty smart. Like I haven't saved this at all, which is really stupid, but I probably should. Anyway, so let me Control Z back so my animation's back, because I don't want to lose my whole setup. So after we do that, okay, now I can go through and set some other stuff. This is now a pose-to-pose animation because my animation is already in there, right? I'm going to go ahead and tweak other properties now, right? I've done a straight ahead. I'm going to go ahead and go to the end, or the second, let's do the second to last keyframe. Okay, I'm going to do the second to last keyframe. And I'm going to click scale. Okay, and it's going to drop a keyframe right there. Now, if this thing is, theoretically punching, like hitting the ground here, and I'm going to go over this keyframe and make this thing hit the ground a little harder. I'm going to retweak my animation a little bit, just using my keyframes. So as it hits the ground, I am going to scale it down, okay? Now, this squash I want to follow through is the idea. Like, notice, since there's only one keyframe, it is squashed the entire way. That's not what I want. I want it to start its squash as it hits the ground the first time and come out of the squash up here. So I'm going to go to this keyframe, unsquash it. So hits the ground, boop, unsquashes, goes back to a squash, and unsquashes at the last keyframe. Now my timing's all off, and this is kind of wacky. There we go. But as you can see, boop, there we go. Hit play. Got a little more life. Not great. It's pretty bad. I'd have to go through and tweak that again. But the idea is you don't have to do this in a linear format, right? That's the thing, is what you want to do as an animator is get your main animation, the position generally, and the rotation set, and then go back through and tweak all your other stuff. That's the smart way to do it. Because that way you're laying down keyframes, you're not fooling with all the other stuff on the timeline, is what it comes down to, okay? So that, as far as basic stuff goes, that's pretty slick, pretty easy. Now, a really cool thing about After Effects, let me show, now this is not exactly what I'd want to do for this section, but I'm gonna go ahead and just eyeball this off. So I'm hiding my little hand sanitizer thing here. I'm gonna grab the logo for 4 hands here, and I'm gonna throw it on screen as well and show you kind of a cool principle in After Effects. Really neat thing. Let's just say, for whatever reason, we want our logo to do the exact same thing as the hand sanitizer bottle, right? So really neat feature of After Effects, you can select keyframes. Okay, Okay, grab and select them down here in your transforms, copy them, Command C or Control C, obviously. You can go up to your other object, okay, wherever you want this animation to start. Okay, it doesn't matter. Maybe I want the logo to come in first. Paste, okay? If I drop down my transforms on my logo, check out what it did. Okay? It animated that logo in the exact same fashion as my hand sanitizer bottle. It pasted all the keyframes in there. Okay? And you can paste these wherever you want. Say I want this animation to happen again, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I could. I can just paste in these keyframes over and over and over again, and now I've got a looping animation. Check that out, right? And I can go in and delete all the stuff I don't want. Say if I don't like this scale, grab that whole set, gone, okay? Each one of these things is up for adjustment on the fly, too. So that's, again, kind of a stupid animation for the logo. But the idea is you can copy and paste keyframes. So smart money, okay? When you guys are animating, animate anything that you need to move across the screen, you know, left to right, up and down, like any elements in the background you want to move. Animate that stuff. Copy and paste your keyframes out before you do anything else. Get all the other objects that are supposed to move in that same fashion done, and then you can go back in and tweak the animations and personalize them. It's kind of the idea. So there's a lot of time savers and work savers in After Effects. That's one of the really cool things about this program is it lets you copy and paste darn near everything. Okay. When we get into doing effects later, like some of the more Hollywood style effects, same thing. You can copy and paste all like any filters or any of that kind of stuff. It's really slick. So that's the basics of transforms. I'm going to close all this stuff. Actually, you know, I'm going to show you one more thing. This is getting pretty, notice the timeline down here is getting pretty hectic already, okay? I've only got 2 things in my timeline down here, and it's getting crazy. I mean, there's already, you'll get 50 or 60 things in this timeline down here, and it gets really hard to manage. Because of that, there are some tools over here you guys are going to want to know. One of these is kind of goofy. This is a Shy Guy. This is like the weirdest icon I've ever seen. It's like supposed to be a guy hanging over a wall, and it's supposed to be his nose. I don't know. It's freaky looking. So the point of it, though, is this little Shy Guy, okay? You can click the Shy Guy, and if you, this down here is a switch, okay? These little things are called switches. They have kind of like parent switches up top, right? So I've put the Shy Guy, okay, on 2 of my layers. If I hit the kind of parent Shy Guy, it hides all that stuff. It's still there, right? You can still access it, but it cleans up your timeline, right? It literally removes stuff from your timeline that you don't want to see, because if you've done the animation on it, you're done with it. Hide it, get it out of the way, because you're gonna have a million other things in that timeline you're fooling with, and it's gonna get real confusing. Then you bring it back just by clicking the Shy Guy again, blammo. So there's all kinds of ways in After Effects to kind of streamline your timeline. This little Shy Guy is a great way of doing that, and it's just this little switch right down here, okay? Just in case you opened up After Effects and you got some other weird stuff going on, and you don't see this little Shy Guy, it's down here in switches and modes. There's actually a whole bunch of other stuff we're going to get into, blending modes and stuff like that. If you don't see the Shy Guy, toggle your switches and modes at the bottom, and it'll come back up over here. So these are your switches. These are your blending modes, which is just like Photoshop. We'll get into that later. So, all right, that's our basic animation. It's pretty crappy, but you get the gist of how to animate stuff. Last thing I wanted to show you is just a text tool. I mean, this one is pretty darn self-explanatory. It's a text tool. I mean, all you do, whoa, zoomed out because of the stupid smart mouse that I have. Click and drag. I'm gonna hit escape. Click and drag. Remember, like in Photoshop, click and drag to define a text box. If you just single click, it's gonna plug that on screen as a piece of text that has no text box, and you can't control it. Always click and drag to define your text box before you put your text in there. Now, I just want to put this in here for just kind of for some reasons to explain some stuff. Remember, video and animation generally are going to be based on pixels. So all the stuff I've crammed in here so far are pixel-based stuff. It's a JPEG, a PNG, that kind of stuff. We don't have to work with raster stuff in After Effects. It will work with vector stuff as well. Okay, so we could bring in vector stuff from Illustrator, like Illustrator files directly, and work with vector stuff. Vector, remember, you can blow vector up to any size and it won't lose quality. Text inside After Effects is vector, okay? The images are not, right? So like this Forehands logo, just a brief illustration of that. I can only scale, there's my anchor points way over there. Let me get rid of my position so I can bring this back on screen here. The logo is low quality, man. Look at that. That's garbage. Already 200%. This looks like total crap, right? There's no way to upscale. You guys know that. There's no way to upscale the quality. After Effects is the same way. It's garbage in, garbage out. You've got to create stuff. I would recommend you create your files larger than what you need for your canvas so you can scale them down and get them in there. But if you need to blow them up, then they've got quality, is the idea. Or vector. Whenever possible, use vector stuff. We'll get into that later in classes, using Illustrator to bring in stuff. But you can work with vector and raster combined. I just wanted to let you know that's possible. Okay. So let's say, again, I'm going to rewind this a little bit. It's going to be a garbage animation, but I want to show you how to render. Okay, this is pretty important. So after you've done your animation, let's say this is my stellar animation that I'm going to turn in here, and I'm ready to get to crank it out so people can actually see it. Now, first things first, obviously you want to save your project. So save this thing like a jillion times. I don't know, whatever. I'm just going to call it untitled. That's okay. That's pretty lazy. Name your stuff. Don't be like me and not name it. That's terrible. Name your files. But once you've saved it, what you're going to do. Now, this is kind of important. This is something I was talking about before. Make sure your timeline is clicked, okay? If your timeline on the bottom isn't clicked, it's going to render something else entirely. You can actually render individual stuff out of your project bin, which is helpful for compositing later on, but we want to make sure we're rendering the timeline. So select the timeline. Good idea to deselect your layers out of your timeline too. So just click in the gray area, click the timeline, make sure it's selected. Go to composition. Okay, and now add to render queue. This is a whole different way of doing it than in any other program. So what After Effects has, and this is also in Premiere as well. If we'll get into this stuff later when we do kind of dual purpose stuff, video and animation. The render queue. So if I say, long story short, you can queue up a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, remember I said each project you can have multiple compositions in. We haven't done that yet, but we're going to do it. Say if you did squash and stretch is one short animation. And you did, pose animation is another animation. Each one was a separate composition, okay? You could load up your compositions into this render queue and render them all at once. Like for my clients, a lot of times I will do videos for them and I'll have like 6 or 7 variations of the videos to use on social media with different text and stuff like that. I'll crank them all out, put them all into the render queue, hit render and walk away and go get a cup of coffee. And they'll render for an hour, 2 hours or whatever. So that's the cool thing is we can load up a bunch of stuff in here in this queue and then let it all rip. So add the render queue. Okay, now, oh boy, there's some settings in here. Okay, this is a little crazy. First things, these are 3 settings we have to set in here to render this thing properly. Okay, this is probably okay by default, but I'm gonna go ahead and click and show you what's in there. It says best settings. If you want a full render, okay. Now remember, the quality of the render dictates how long this thing takes to render, right? It is not unusual. I'm going to warn you guys ahead of time. It is not unusual if you get into doing effects work, especially to have renders take days. I'm talking 24 to 48 hours for a full render. You do not want to wait for that. If you have something that you're not sure if it looks any good, that's stupid. You can turn it down to draft quality. Draft quality looks like garbage, but it renders real fast if you're trying to test something. So if you're test rendering, draft is the way to go. Wireframe is damn near useless. It's something later on we would do for 3D compositing, but that's the important thing. Whatever quality you're looking at here. Best, I'm going to start with. Click OK. All right. Output module, where it says lossless. This is the most important part. Click this one. Okay. Now, this gets into all kinds of fiddly video stuff. I'm gonna boil it down real kind of short here. There are all kinds of formats we can render in. I mean, there's many different formats you can render in. These are your render formats, okay? We've got all kinds of different stuff we're gonna use for different purposes, like later on down the line. Generally, you wanna leave this on QuickTime, okay? That leans on you having QuickTime installed in your machine though. If you don't have this option, you gotta install QuickTime to actually get this. So have QuickTime selected, okay? Format options, really important, format options. This is the biggie, okay? In here, there are many different format options we're gonna be using here, okay? Generally, animation's pretty good for this, but I found animation cranks out a huge file. It's trying to keep your file like really clean, so it's gigantic and it takes forever to render. It's full quality though. Now, with this machine, I'm not gonna do that, and I don't know if Canvas would even take full quality render. I'm not positive it could even handle that. They get, I'm telling you, gigs. Like, your renders on some, not these small ones, but longer animations, not uncommon to get a render that's like 7 or 8 gig, So you want to be careful when you're doing this, like not to render it too large. What I'm going to choose though, okay, DV Pro this NTSC or DV Pro HD 1080p 30. This is your standard for most video output formats that you're going to get for TVs and phones and that kind of jazz. DVC Pro, or you could use DV NTSC, but that's smaller. DVC, the 30 frames a second is what we want though, because we started in 30 frames a second. We want to end at 30 frames a second. If you change your frame rate, be careful with this, because if you change it to 15, it's going to do some weird stuff. Okay. So DVC Pro HD 1080, okay on that. Okay, click OK here, and then I can click this little last thing is where your file is going to go. Right. So you click this not yet specified down here, and it will ask you where you want to put this thing. Okay. I'm going to put it in a motion graphics folder. I'm going to make a new folder and call it renders. Great. Save. And then over here in the bottom right hand corner, you hit render. Okay. And now this thing will go through its little render and you'll see it real time on the screen. Now, look how long this is taking to render this, just for this crappy, like, couple of second animation. Now, the thing I did wrong here is I'm gonna show you how to fix this in a second. I rendered my entire timeline, right? My full 30 seconds worth of stuff. I don't want 30 seconds worth because I only animated about 6 seconds of this. The other rest of it is dead space, which is stupid. Okay, I don't want all that on there. So if you're noticing when you're rendering something, ah, crap, I left my timeline like way too long. I'm gonna wait for this to finish rendering, or I could stop it if it's not what I want. Okay, I'm gonna go back to, notice you have 2 tabs down here, render queue and principles of animation. The one that's the actual composition. Go back to your composition if you want to shorten it, because I've only got, I mean, like, really about 5 seconds worth of animation here. Composition settings. Okay, you can always change your composition settings. If I know it's only 6 seconds long, check this out. Down here in my duration, you can always change the duration of your time on After Effects. So if it's 30 seconds isn't long enough, I can augment that, but I know it is. I'm just going to do 6 seconds. Okay, so now my timeline, hours, minutes, seconds, frames. Okay, 6 seconds long, click OK. Ah, look at that. Now my timeline is the correct length. And now if I do it again, I go composition, add to render queue. Now, I'm going to show you this other option as well. And I will see if this computer dies when I click this. Really, you'd rather run it through the media encoder queue. So there is something baked into the Adobe suite called the Adobe Media Encoder. If you are going to use After Effects on your own machine, you also need to install the Media Encoder because it's really slick. If you add this to the Media Encoder queue, we're going to see whether my computer keels over or not. This isn't promising. I'm not sure whether the Media Encoder was installed properly on here. We're going to find out in a second or two. So what it should do right out of the gate, and I'm going to minimize some stuff to see if it's doing it. It is. Hooray. Somebody installed it. Huzzah. If you do this, this will launch the Adobe Media Encoder. Now, the Media Encoder is kind of like the render queue. Okay? This encodes your file. It will pass off your file from After Effects to the Media Encoder. Now, the Media Encoder gives you way more options. You get way more options than you would out of just straight up After Effects. The cool thing about this as well is this will actually take projects from Premiere as well at the same time. You can actually render up projects from Premiere and After Effects at the same time and compose them together in this Media Encoder. It's pretty slick. Okay, it's going to take a second because the computer's working a little slow, but it's going to load up my file in this Media Encoder. The only part you got to worry about over here is this window right here. Ignore all the rest of this stuff. It's kind of useless in all honesty. This is what we want. It should in a minute, whenever the computer chooses to catch up, load my file from After Effects in here. Okay, it's going to take a second. When it does, we're going to get, oh, please do. There we go. Hey, look at that. Now, check this out. Okay, this gives us an option we did not get earlier. This is how I want you to render your project. So I want you to run it through the Media Encoder to render this. H.264. The previous file, that QuickTime file, that DV NTSC thing that I rendered, is not an H.264 format. Okay, H.264 is the standard streaming web format that everything needs to be encoded to go on the web. Like everything you put up on the web needs to be in H.264. Right here, it's just in a little drop down. It's really slick. You click H.264, you can choose all kinds of different things to render it to. Check this out. Now, this is the really cool part. Wherever your destination is, this takes your animation and encodes the stream. Now, streaming video, I don't know if you guys know what the hell that even means. When you say this animation was 40 minutes long, right? Like a video on Netflix, right? Say if you watch a show on Netflix, that entire show, literally that entire like 12 gigabyte file is sitting on a server somewhere. It feeds you pieces of that at a time. It loads pieces of that into your browser at a time so you can watch it without it buffering. I grew up in the days of the internet that didn't have streaming, and you had to wait to load a whole video. Sometimes it was like an hour before you could watch a damn video, which was ridiculous. If you encode it properly, say if I knew I was going to put this on YouTube, okay? Now I'm kind of missing my YouTube settings because this stupid screen sharing thing's in the way, so I'm going to go ahead and do like the Facebook one. If it's in Facebook, like for Facebook 1080, I click this, that encodes the stream directly for Facebook to work with their streaming algorithm. It's a different encoding than YouTube's, a different encoding than Vimeo, a different encoding than all the streaming platforms. They have their own proprietary streaming algorithm. This matches that. You will get the best quality stream, like highest quality, and it will stream the fastest if you choose these options. It's a big deal. It actually makes a huge difference. So that's why this media encoder is so helpful. Now I'm going to choose my destination. And again, the same folder, but I could call this one like Principles of Animation 2, and we can see the file size difference here, okay? Hit the little green button up top, and it will render. Same deal as the last one, basically, but we're going to compare some stuff. Now, it's going a little slower, like I said, because my computer's a little wonky here for some reason. But it will start, there we go. But check that out. Blam, look how fast that was, right? That was about twice or 3 times as fast as After Effects. So the really cool thing about this is I could send my project to here to render, okay? I can close After Effects while I'm doing that. I don't even have to have After Effects running to render this file. This is all kind of self-contained now and loaded into Adobe Media Encoder. So you can load this stuff up, close After Effects for a faster render.